Welcome to the online tour of the Parliamentary Archives. I'm Mari Takayanagi, Senior Archivist in the Parliamentary Archives, and I'm your host for your visit today. Together we will explore our wonderful building and collections. In this tour, you will find out all about the archives, the Victoria Tower where they are stored, the Great Fire of 1834 when so many documents were burned, who looks after the archives, and how you can find out more about our historic collections from the comfort of your own laptop or phone. The Parliamentary Archives are the custodians of unique, globally significant collections that document British democratic heritage. The Archives holds about 4 million historical records of the House of Commons and House of Lords, dating back more than 500 years here in the Victoria Tower. In this tour, we will give you a close-up look at original Acts of Parliament, including one of the very earliest we hold from 1497, a Royal Commission with the beautiful signature and huge seal of Queen Elizabeth I, and a Suffragette banner unfurled in the House of Commons in 1908. I'm now standing beneath the Victoria Tower in what is known as Sovereign's Entrance. I'll come to the significance of the name shortly. The Victoria Tower is not as well known as its world-famous neighbour with the clock, the Elizabeth Tower or Big Ben, but it should be. Let's now go inside. Standing quietly on the other side of Parliament, Victoria Tower was one of the last parts of the new Palace of Westminster to be completed in 1860, 26 years after the old Houses of Parliament were destroyed by a terrible fire. It was built to do three things: serve as an entrance for the monarch when they entered Parliament, fly the flag from the top of the tower, and be the home of the Parliamentary Archives. Work started on the tower when William IV was monarch, and was originally called the King's Tower. It was renamed when Queen Victoria was crowned in 1837 at the age of 18. It is the tallest tower in the Palace of Westminster and was the tallest stone square tower in the world when it was built. It would have dominated the London skyline in the way that the Shard does today. Let's now go inside. We are now in the Palace of Westminster, outside the Archives search room. This is where our staff bring the archives down from the Victoria Tower to the search room for people to view and do their research. Anyone can make an appointment to view the archives in the Parliamentary Archives public search room. The Parliamentary Archives hold some of our most important constitutional documents, as well as many other documents that govern the lives of people in the UK and beyond, on subjects including elections and voting, health, education and taxation, and private lives, including births, marriages and deaths. Parliament began to preserve and keep its archives in 1497, during the reign of King Henry VII, and our earliest record dates from that year. Our most recent record might date from last week, because we continue to acquire records from across Parliament today. Today, we help Parliament manage its current information and records, and the records which need to be preserved permanently come here. They might be physical or digital. We have more than 13 kilometres of physical archives stored in the Victoria Tower and more than 22 terabytes of digital archives held in our digital repository. We don't hold the archives of government or the Crown. These are held by the National Archives at Kew. We do hold the historic records of the House of Commons and House of Lords, other organisations relating to Parliament, a few collections of personal political papers, and records relating to the Palace of Westminster as a building. So our role is to preserve and make available the archives of Parliament so they can be seen and kept by future generations. So how does the story of the Victoria Tower begin? Let's find out. In 1834, a terrible fire started beneath the House of Lords. The fire began because of several cartloads of wooden tally sticks. These sticks were used for an old system of accounting to record debts, but were no longer needed. Workers were told to burn them, and they chose to do so in stoves in the basement of the House of Lords. A bad idea. They overloaded the stoves and set fire to the building. Much of the palace was constructed of timber, covered with plaster, which meant that fire could quickly spread. Officials had warned about the fire risk to Parliament, but nothing had been done. It was an accident waiting to happen. By 6:30 p.m, on the 16th of October 1834, the fire had spread, and a huge fireball exploded through the roof of the Houses of Parliament. The scale of the fire was enormous, the biggest in London since the Great Fire of 1666. The King and Queen could see the blaze from Windsor Castle, around 20 miles away, as could passengers in stagecoaches travelling along the top of the South Downs. Crowds gathered in the streets to watch the inferno. Many artists captured the event as it happened.
Truly astonishing. From the time of the House of Commons first taking fire, till the flames were rushing out of every aperture, it could not be more than 5 or 6 minutes.
Only Westminster Hall, the Jewel Tower, and a small cloister in the House of Commons survived. But what happened to the archives? Well, most of the House of Commons archives stored in the palace were burned. Only a few Commons archives were saved from the fire. Some were bundled up in curtains and thrown out of windows. These surviving records incurred considerable fire damage, and some have water damage. They are now very delicate. However, the House of Lords archives were luckily stored outside the main palace in the Jewel Tower and survived, including all the Acts of Parliament. The fire represents one of the biggest disasters for UK democratic heritage. It also meant that Parliament needed a secure place to store its surviving precious records. After the destruction from the 1834 fire, a competition was launched to design the new Houses of Parliament. Learning from the mistakes of the fire, a compulsory part of the design for the competition was there had to be fireproof repositories for the archives and books. This was one of the specifications set out by the House of Lords. Charles Barry, with assistance from Augustus Pugin, won the competition. They designed and built the new Palace of Westminster together, including the building of Victoria Tower as a purpose-built archive. The first stone of the tower was laid on the 22nd of December, 1843. The proposed height of the tower was about 200 feet in Barry's original plan, but the height of the tower steadily increased during its construction. Barry was very proud of Victoria Tower and thought that it was what he would be remembered for. There is a brass engraving of Victoria Tower on his memorial in Westminster Abbey. At the time, it was the tallest stone square tower in the world. The tower was built with a cast iron framework to strengthen the structure. There were originally 9 floors, connected with an iron spiral staircase, which is still in use today. The tower underwent major redevelopment between 1948 and 1963 to provide 12 floors of air-conditioned archive storage and a lift, and again between 2000 and 2004 to bring the air conditioning up to contemporary archive storage standards. Today, there are 13 kilometres of shelving and approximately 4 million records. A 13th floor contains the air conditioning plant, and on the 14th floor is the flag deck. Today, the tower measures 325 feet, or 98.5 metres, from the ground to the roof of the tower. One major feature of the archives is the well at the bottom of the spiral staircase. Let's go and see it and find out its significance. We call this the well. It's a closable hatch above the arch of Sovereign's entrance. It's mainly used today for hoisting things into the Victoria Tower, which are too big or awkwardly shaped to come in any other way. It's not used for moving archives. The arch is known as Sovereign's entrance because it's traditionally the only way that a monarch was allowed to enter Parliament. Since the 17th century, no reigning monarch has gone any further than the chamber of the House of Lords. The Victoria Tower has a flagpole on its roof, and usually the Union flag flies from there. But because the Palace of Westminster is a royal palace, when the monarch arrives, the Union flag is changed to the royal standard. When the monarch sets foot in Parliament, a soldier alerts officials on the roof of the Victoria Tower, who pull down the Union flag and raise the royal standard. Let's now go to one of the archive's strong rooms and find out more about how the archives are stored and preserved. This is the original cast iron staircase designed by Barry inside the Victoria Tower. It is 553 steps from top to bottom. After the tower was completed in 1860, the House of Lords moved all their historic records from the Jewel Tower into the Victoria Tower. The House of Commons started to send their own archives after they started to build up again after the fire. The archives were not well organised in those days. There were no archive staff to look after them, just House of Lords clerks during their spare time. But the task must have been overwhelming. The conditions were very bad. The smoky and acidic atmosphere of London pollution, especially during the Victorian era, caused the limestone exterior of the tower to deteriorate. After the Second World War, the House of Lords finally set up a department to look after the archives, the House of Lords Record Office. Today we are known as the Parliamentary Archives. The first Clerk of the Records, Francis Needham, was appointed in 1946, but he only lasted a year because he was claustrophobic. The next clerk, Maurice stayed here in his post for 40 years and set up all the functions of a record office or archive that are still in use today, but updated according to modern standards and practices. Let's go into one of the strong rooms where the archives are kept and meet one of the conservators who look after our collection.
Hello, I'm Katerina Lejna. I'm the Collection Care Manager of the Parliamentary Archive. My role is to make sure that the collection is accessible now and in the future by managing a series of conservation and preservation activities. We are in Strong Room 5, one of the 12 strong rooms spread out in Victoria Tower. The Collection Care team is responsible for facilitating public access to and engagement with the collection now and in the future. How do we do that? Collection Care does not work on its own. We work with a variety of stakeholders across Westminster Palace, from heritage collection teams to security and estate management teams, internal and external suppliers, and universities. Collection Care is an active part of the heritage community within and beyond the palace walls. How do we care for the collection? Our focus is on conservation and preservation. Conservation is the hands-on repair of damaged or deteriorated objects. We take action to prevent or slow down deterioration of the item, and this differs from restoration that focuses on bringing an item back to its original appearance or function. We might not be able to repair every damaged item in our vast collection, but through surveying the condition and identifying problems, we can prioritize the ones in critical condition and treat them. The driving force behind what we decide to treat is making the collection accessible to everyone. An example of conservation practice is the repair of broken wax seals. The activities which prolong the life of archival records without interfering with the structure of an item is called preservation. This minimizes the deterioration of records and prevents the loss of valuable information. How do we achieve that? We manage the environment within the repositories so that it is safe. When you walk into a repository, you notice the low temperature. It's very cold, about 16 degrees Celsius. We monitor and control temperature and relative humidity following best practice guides. If the humidity is too high, documents become moist and mold can develop. If the humidity is too low, the documents, paper or parchment, start to dry out and make the records brittle and fragile and prone to damage. We store many types of material: parchment, paper, leather, wax, plastics, photographic and audiovisual material, textiles, metal, wood, and even stone. They all have different environmental requirements. Our conservators make sure that the right balance is maintained for all of them. We also manage pest infestations. Our repositories are monitors for pests and rodents. We restrict food and drinks in our strong rooms and raise awareness by training and inductions. And we also monitor pest activities by setting traps. We manage light. Fading of documents and other items causes cumulative and irreversible damage. Our repositories have no natural light and remain dark when not in use. But levels of light are monitored when items are on display and used in exhibitions. It is very important to remember that caring for collection does not mean locking them up in rooms to keep them safe. It's our mission to share what we hold with the public. In our studios, collection items are prepared for exhibitions, loans, and outreach activities. They are condition checked, treated, mounted, and prepared for transportation. Collection Care offers regular handling training to staff and researchers to protect the collection from accidental damage. Improper storage can also affect the longevity of the collection. Collection items stored on open shelves without any protection are exposed to dust and pollutants and rapid changes of environmental conditions. Today, most of our physical collection is protectively housed in high-quality archival packaging, but that has not always been the case. Over the years, trends in materials and types of packaging have shaped the archival strongrooms. Which brings us to the last and very important element of caring for the collection and at the heart of all of our activities: research. Our conservation and preservation activities are enhanced with the appropriate scientific research and data analysis. The cultural heritage community thrives in sharing and learning from each other, and we continue to learn throughout our careers. Sustainability, both social and environmental, are huge factors in our decision-making. This enables the collection to be enjoyed by as many generations as possible, now and in the future.
We will now make the final part of our journey up to floor 8 to the TLS, what we call the Tower Learning Space. On the way, I can tell you about the archives during wartime. During the Second World War, the archives were mostly evacuated from London to escape bombing, like many people also did. In 1941, a dramatic scene also unfolded at Victoria Tower during the Blitz. A firebomb landed on the roof of the tower from a German bomber plane. Police Sergeant Andrew Forbes tried to find the key to the spiral staircase to reach the blaze, but the key couldn't be found. In desperation, Forbes climbed the scaffolding around the tower with a sandbag on his shoulder in just 20 minutes. Forbes was about to fling his sandbag onto the fire when a jet of water shot past him. Firefighters had gained access to the staircase and were racing up to the roof. The water managed to put out the flames and save the tower. We are now ready for the final part of the tour, where you will get to see some of our most interesting and historically important items in the collection. This is the TLS, the Tower Learning Space. It's where we display some of our most important and interesting documents for people to look at on the physical tour. From here you have fine views over the Palace of Westminster and the heart of London. We're now going to explore some of our most important archives, starting with one of our earliest Acts of Parliament. We hold original Acts of Parliament dating back to 1497, about 64,000 of them. Early acts are quite short and on single sheets. These acts were made from parchment, which is specially treated dried skin from animals, such as goats, calves and sheep. Analysis shows that most of Parliament's acts are made from sheepskin. This act dates from 1497, which is when Parliament first started to collect records and store them in Westminster. It's about criminal offences, including riots and perjury. It was signed by the reigning monarch, King Henry VII. This is his signature, HR, in the top left-hand corner. The act was drawn up in the House of Commons. It's handwritten in English, although it can be hard to read. At the bottom is a phrase in Norman French, which was spoken at court and the language of the ruling class at this time. Acts were often signed by the monarch until the reign of Elizabeth I. Since then, the monarch has signed a separate document to give assent to acts, called a royal commission. Acts don't include a wax seal, although royal commissions do. As acts became longer, they wouldn't fit on one piece of parchment anymore, so were stitched together into rolls. The rolls come in all sizes. The longest act is about 1/4 mile long if unrolled, the entire length of the Palace of Westminster. All of our acts are in English, but the royal assent formula on the first page is in Norman French, which is usually La Reine le veut, the Queen wishes it, or Le Roi le veut, the King wishes it. There are also some very small rolled acts, mostly personal acts about things like divorces, naturalisations, name changes. Here's one of them. This is a private act from 1727. It is for the famous composer George Friedrich Handel, who composed Messiah and wrote music for English monarchs Queen Anne, King George I and King George II. The act grants him British citizenship. Until 1844, a foreign-born individual could only become a British subject by means of an Act of Parliament. This was not an easy process. It was known as naturalisation and was often undertaken by a means of a private act which named a specific person. Born in Germany in 1685, Handel moved to London as a young man in 1710. He stayed in England until his death in 1759. The process of naturalisation was expensive, and usually a number of people were naturalised together to save on costs. This is reflected in that it's not just Handel being naturalised, but also Louis Secahay, Anthony Firstinu and Michael Schlegel. You can often see amendments on acts, which are scribblings, words crossed out, words added in, and pieces of parchment stitched on with extra information. It was painstaking work and slow. Here, Handel's name has been stitched in and inserted as an amendment. From 1850, the final version of the Acts was printed in book form, which made them easier to use, and that's how they are still produced today. Here's an example. This is the Ballot Act of 1872. It was introduced by Parliament because employers and landowners were able to intimidate employees and farm tenants to influence how they voted, using bribery, intimidation, or blackmail. Voters didn't have a private polling booth to vote in. They would often have to reveal their choice in hustings or public meetings between voters and candidates. The Ballot Act introduced the secret ballot for local and government elections. It meant that voters could vote in private without being intimidated into voting for a particular party. It also meant it was harder for bribers to ensure that voters did as they wanted. Modern acts are tied with a red ribbon and are signed at the back by the Clerk of the Parliaments. One question we are often asked is, why does Parliament still use parchment? There really isn't anything that is as durable as parchment to preserve documents. Acts from 500 years ago are still readable, and many in good condition. The oldest parchment in the world is estimated to be about 2,000 years old. However, in 2017, Parliament decided to stop using parchment for acts. They still have a parchment cover, but the pages are made of archival paper. This is one of the rare House of Commons archives that survived the 1834 fire. This is a record of the proceedings in the House of Commons on the 24th of January, 1581. It tells us about a rebuke from Queen Elizabeth I to the House of Commons. Public fasting was a regular occurrence in medieval times as part of religious worship. Typically, it meant that people were restricted in what they could eat or drink during the fasting period. On the 21st of January 1581, the House of Commons decided to impose a fast on the public. This was a direct challenge to Elizabeth, as it was the Queen's exclusive right to order public fasts. The Queen had told the Commons not to interfere in religious matters. 3 days later, the Queen's disapproval was reported to the House, which agreed to apologise to her. It gives us an insight into the relationship between Elizabeth I and Parliament. Here's another document about Queen Elizabeth I. On this document, we can see in detail the beautiful signature of Elizabeth I. It's an order from 1573 from the Queen to prorogue Parliament. This allowed the monarch to stop Parliament meeting. It's in Latin. The Queen's Great Seal is present. The wax seal is still in good condition. What is striking is that the signature not only dominates the document because of its size, it is ornate and powerfully conveys her royal status. During Elizabeth I's reign, her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, was the rightful heir to succeed Elizabeth to the English throne. Parliament wanted to pass a bill that would stop Mary from becoming Queen of England. In 1572, Elizabeth prorogued Parliament to stop this happening. It meant Parliament was put on hold so that it could not meet and pass any legislation. It didn't meet again until 4 years later. Parliament could only meet if Elizabeth called it. Parliament met just 13 times in her reign, for an average of 3 weeks a year. This is a letter from King Charles I to his nephew, Prince Maurice, in 1644, during the English Civil War. It's mainly written in cipher and is in the King's handwriting, apart from the deciphered words, and is signed by him. By changing or rearranging the letters in words, Charles hoped that the message was secret. Charles, writing from Buckingham, says, "It is a great contentment to me to find you so ready to follow my directions." Maurice's brother, Prince Rupert, however, is said to be misinformed, not only of matters but of some persons. After the Battle of Naseby in 1645, Charles I was forced to flee, leaving behind his cannons and baggage, including a cabinet containing his secret papers, known as the Naseby Letters. These fell into the hands of Sir Thomas Fairfax and the Parliamentary Army. The letters were taken to London, deciphered, and some published by order of Parliament in a pamphlet called The King's Cabinet Opened. The timing of the publication during the trial of Charles I was a nice piece of spin. The King's nephew, Maurice, was French, and the suggestion was that Charles was asking the French to invade Britain, a treasonous act, some might say. This is what's called a deposited plan. It shows a plan to improve Dundee Harbour on the east coast of Scotland, and is signed by the famous engineer Thomas Telford. Thomas Telford was responsible for the construction, in Britain and abroad, of a large number of canals, more than 1,000 bridges, and many hundreds of miles of roads. These plans are still important today. Lawyers consult them to understand, for instance, where rights-of-way are positioned, and family and local historians look at them to see who lived in the area at the time and gather other useful information. This is a contemporary copy of the American Declaration of Independence, dated 4th of July, 1776. It's handwritten on paper and tied with a red thread. Why does the Parliamentary Archives hold this? Well, it was one of a bundle of papers laid before the House of Lords on the 20th of January 1778 about the state of the nation. The American states had declared their independence in this document. Before photocopying or digitisation were possible, the only way to make copies of important documents was to print them, which was expensive, or to write them out again by hand, as has been done here. This is something you might not expect in the Parliamentary Archives. It's part of a gravestone. This fragment was used as evidence in a 19th century court case. It was brought to the Committee for Privileges of the House of Lords in 1847 in the Tracy peerage claim. James Tracy produced the fragments, claiming it was the gravestone of William Tracy, his great-grandfather. He alleged that the gravestone, which was dated 1734, had been found in the hearth of an old house, close to Castlebrack churchyard in Ireland. The Attorney-General, however, produced a witness who testified to having forged the gravestone for Mr. Tracy. It had been broken into 4 pieces and held over the fire to make it look older. His peerage claim was rejected, and the title remains dormant to this day. We keep the stones as records of the House's proceedings. This is a suffragette banner from 1908. On the 28th of October that year, suffragettes carried out 3 dramatic protests in Parliament. They smuggled the banner into the Ladies' Gallery, passed it through the grille that covered the window, and lowered it into the debating chamber of the House of Commons. It demands, on behalf of the Women's Freedom League, the right to vote for women on equal terms as men. At the same time, suffragettes Muriel Matters and Helen Fox chained themselves to the grille of the Ladies' Gallery. The authorities had to remove the grille before the locks could be filed off, and proceedings in the House had to stop during the commotion. Afterwards, the banner was rolled up and put away and forgotten about for decades. It was rediscovered in 2000 and given to the archives. It's possible the banner may have been kept as evidence for a court case against the suffragette protesters, but they were never charged. This is the Accession Declaration of Queen Elizabeth II. Princess Elizabeth was staying in Kenya with her husband, Prince Philip, when she heard the news of the death of her father, King George VI, on 6th of February 1952. Without delay, she returned home, where she was proclaimed Queen Elizabeth II, aged just 25. Elizabeth's succession to the throne was proclaimed at an Accession Council in St James's Palace. 9 months later, Elizabeth II attended her first state opening of Parliament on the 4th of November 1952, where she read and signed the Accession Declaration. She then made her first Queen's Speech to Parliament. Her coronation, or formal accession to the throne, took place the following year in 1953. The story of Parliament is told through its archives, and we act as custodians of the archives on behalf of the British people. The records of the House of Commons and House of Lords lie at the heart of our parliamentary democracy. They've embedded our liberties, our rights and responsibilities for the last 500 years, and include some of the most important constitutional records in the world. They touch on the lives of everyone in the UK, and indeed across the world. Our role is to ensure that the story can continue to be told and understood, both now and into the future.